Hello, everybody. I am Ilmari Rostila, chairman of Suomalaisuuden Liitto, Association of Finnish Culture and Identity, and we are here now talking about sociologist Frank Furedi's book, Why Borders Matter, Why Humanity Must Relearn the Art of Drawing Boundaries. And we have our aim is to discuss about the book, to give some points of view for you to inspire you to read the book, which is now translated by the name. The title is Rajat, merkitsevät, yhteisö, rajat ja arvottaminen. You can purchase the new translation from our website and from most online Finnish bookshops. So if you get interested, you may acquire this book of your own. And it is my utmost pleasure to introduce and welcome as my guests here today two wonderful people. Firstly, Her Excellency, the new Ambassador of Hungary to Finland, Klára Breuer. Welcome. Please welcome. And then the scholar, commentator and prolific author who has published more than 25 books, numerous articles, columns, and so on, Professor Emeritus Frank Furedi. Welcome.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
Now we are going to proceed in a way that Ambassador of Hungary will make one question, or maybe if it needs more than one, and then I'm continuing to some of my questions. So please, Klára Breuer.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Alliance, Suomalaisuuden Liitto, for the invitation, because I know that you have cooperated with the Hungarian embassy and with my predecessors for many decades, perhaps, and you now give me the chance to get to know personally Professor Furedi, and I am quite happy that my fellow countrymen's book is now available in Finnish. So I'd like to welcome all members of the association. I think when we look at this title, we might consider physical or geographical borders or limitations. But now I'd like to ask you about a little bit of backwards and forwards limitations, if I may. We in Hungary sometimes cite Goethe, the intellectual giant, who was saying that the most we can give to our children is roots and wings. And I'd like to ask you first, how do you see the situation today? How are we faring with these roots and wings concept?
Well, you know, when Goethe was talking about roots and wings, he understood that the two are actually related to each other. So you cannot really fly until you've learned something about where you come from, being grounded. And one of the things that I think is really important, and we fail very often, is to understand that children need roots. But by roots, it isn't just simply a physical root, although they all need to be familiar with a certain space. They feel secure with a geographical entity. But they also need certain cultural resources that gives them the identity and the confidence of knowing that this is where they come from, this is what they are like. And very often It's through understanding a little bit about your family, your ancestors, and very importantly about your history, that you begin to see what is special, what is distinct about your existence. And as you know, when children develop, they develop by distinguishing themselves. So when you're a baby, the first distinction you make is between boys and girls. Children understand that they're not like the other gender. And as they become older, these ideals are internalized to the point you don't have to think about them. And the way that I understand it as a father as well, not just as a sociologist, is if you've got strong roots, then your child's got the security and the confidence to be able to fly. And by flying, we don't just mean physically flying, but the ability to gain a degree of independence, which is one of the most precious gifts we can give to a child, whereby through that independence they can experiment, they can take risks, they can really add to the world. I think that the most important things that flying does is that you don't just simply take your heritage with you, but through your flying, you in a sense make an addition, as every generation does, to what humanity has done beforehand. And in this book, what I try to explain is that if we don't take borders seriously, then very often the boundary that you need between a child and an adult becomes eroded. And we have this phenomenon in Anglo-American world where the elders become infantilized. A lot of men and women in their 30s and the 40s want to be like their children. They want to be very cool. They wear T-shirts like their kids have. And they don't realize that their role is not to be like the child's friend, but to be the child's parent. It's a very different phenomenon. And when that boundary goes, then the children actually end up being confused, because we think that we're helping the kids, but the kids have got nothing to react against. They have no way of knowing how to make their way in the world forward. And to me, that problem is very important, because it means that children then suffer from what we call an identity crisis earlier on. So I think Goethe is great, and I very often give my students, there's a book that he wrote called The Young Werther, where it's a wonderful little book. It's the first modern bestseller that young people read, and it's very much about the struggles that a young man has, tragically ends, about sort of being able to fly, having wings.
Yes, I have to say here that my background is also in social sciences, and we are now situated in this Pori University Consortium house where I was working like 15 years, and from point of social scientist, I'm very interested in how your work has been kind of started, and how did it develop, because you have written many books on a wide range of topics, such as therapy, culture, tolerance, authority, populism, and identity. And I wonder, how does the book Why Borders Matter connect to your previous writings, and what actually inspired you to write this very book?
Well, what happened was, a long time ago, it was in around 1999, 2000, I was like a very old father, and I realized when my son was growing up how different his experience was to mine, and in particular how different was the way that children were being brought up. So I wrote a book called Paranoid Parenting, which was the only book I ever wrote that was a bestseller, unfortunately. That was the one that grabbed people's imagination. And the point that I was trying to make was that the adult world has lost the capacity to make distinctions between an adult and adult and a child. So that was always in the back of my mind. And then what happened was that I was always concerned about the fact that in Western societies we found it very difficult to make judgments. So that as a result of that, the moral boundary between right and wrong, or good and evil, were being confused. And in a number of books I began to write about the danger of non-judgmentalism, which in Britain and America is the most important value. And if you judge somebody, then you're meant to be evil. But if you don't judge anybody, then that's meant to be good. And I made the point that if I don't judge Klára, then that means I don't take her seriously. I don't care what she says. Whereas unless you're kind of judging all the time, that's a very creative way. But also that's the only way that we can have a sense of what is good and what is bad. And that's how I became interested in borders and boundaries in the first instance. And then when the migration issue came, and when there was big debates in Europe about open borders, it was a natural connection for me, because I could finally understand why it was that so many people thought that there shouldn't be any borders, any national borders. And that's because they lost sight of the need for any kind of limits, any kind of framework within to work.
Yes, please.
You were, I think, leading us to the problem of tolerance and how to be judgmental in a, I would say, positive way, that at the same time we can still be tolerant. Because what I hear from you, and what I also sometimes feel, that we need to tolerate anything, everything and anything. So how does an individual figure out how to be positively judgmental, listening to the other person, and at the same time tolerant?
Well, it's an interesting question that you pose, because it's being debated in a lot of places. I think tolerance is one of the most misunderstood values. Because increasingly when people talk about tolerance, people think it means being nice. Right? But if you look at the origins of the liberal value of tolerance, it's a wonderful value. It came about because during the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, they realized that unless they do something, everybody will be killed. There was very, very bloody wars, and that you had to tolerate that somebody was a Catholic, and if you're a Catholic, you had to tolerate that somebody was a Protestant, even though you didn't agree with their religion, even though you thought they were absolutely wrong and evil. So John Locke and Pierre Bayle in France began to develop this idea where tolerance essentially means that, and the original word was toleration, and what tolerance meant was that everybody's got a right to their own views, everybody's got a right to their own beliefs, their own conviction, regardless of whether or not I agree with it. And the important thing about tolerance, that's to me quite important, is that it's not the opposite of judgment. It presupposes judgment. Because unless I know that you're wrong, I don't tolerate you. If we agree on everything, there's no tolerance there, because there's no point in toleration. So tolerance means, it's a very difficult ideal, that you're prepared to live with people whose views contradict your own, and you recognize that it's a only creative way of living in a modern kind of a world. And I take the view that I'm prepared to tolerate anybody's views. In other words, even the most despicable, depraved kind of opinions, I'm prepared to live with it, so long as it's at the level of ideals and views, and rather than of physically leading to some corrosive, destructive consequences. And the question is important because despite the fact that in the European Union tolerance is a primary value, their view of tolerance is what I would call intolerance. Because what they are really saying is, we're very nice to each other, we tolerate, except for, and then they have all these views that are not tolerable. So in fact, they violate the most fundamental principle of liberalism, which is of genuine tolerance. And I think that people like ourselves need to be sensitive to each other's views. we have to learn how to speak and be grown up in dealing with our differences, rather than simply saying, I don't want to hear you, I hate what you're saying, therefore there's no basis for dialogue.
Yes. In terms of tolerance, of course, we know that university, scholarship, science and so on should be the very place for tolerance, discussing different opinions and really trying to understand better the world and the things that we are living with. In my opinion, your themes or your way of dealing with these themes that we are discussing is very much kind of from the background of my experience in Finland. They are not that common for an average social scientist. And then there is the question of today's university and the question about the tolerance in universities, which should be the places for this open discussion. And so, just a kind of frank, straightforward question, how do you colleagues and students react to your thinking and writing nowadays in your university environment where you are active?
Well, you know, when I was a young lecturer, it was very evident that it was easier to speak freely in the university than outside of the university. There was much more freedom in the universities than on the streets, whereas now it's the opposite. There's much more free speech and much greater tolerance of people's views when I go to a bar, have a drink with ordinary people, than when I go to an academic conference. I was at an academic conference in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, and I really felt like I was, sort of an English soldier in Nazi Germany, because everybody's views was totally the opposite. And I called up my wife and I said to her, I'm just going to take a lot of long walks until I speak, because there's no point talking to these people, because everything that I said they would imagine would be racist, or it would be homophobic, or some kind of phobic. So you have that kind of, and particularly Americans are the worst. It's when I give a lecture in America, I get incredible hostility. It's better in Europe, and some places it's okay. But in terms of my university, I think that if you know your argument, and if you're open-minded, and if you use humor, then I think you can get by quite easily. And I think my strength, the way I managed to survive the pressure, is that I've always been fairly popular with students. So I get more students to come to my classes very often than others, just because, my job is to create interest and try to inspire them a little bit. So I have never had any problem in the university. I've never been, even though I know that my colleagues don't love me, it's never been a problem for me, just because if you know your stuff, and if you have a bit of courage, then I think you can get by. And I think that I wish there were more people like me who entered the university rather than left it. But I can understand the problems.
The technological development is a given thing, and it has a lot of blessings. We use our clever phones or other instruments, but at the same time, we are going to be a little bit isolated from each other, even physically, because everybody is pushing the buttons on the telephones or on the computer. And we already know that the algorithms are kind of re-strengthening our own ideas, which means that we are kind of sitting in our intellectual bubble, and there is not much chance for debating things, as you were saying. And I think it's extremely important, because this also kind of gives feedback to you that your thinking is right or not. What can we do in this modern world with the developments, technical developments, to kind of go against this tide?
Well, you know, the problem isn't just the technology, but the culture that underpins that. Mm-hmm. Because we live in a world of cultural segregation, mm-hmm. where you know, the difference in cultural outlook is so profound that it creates this unbridgeable chasm. And the question you raise is something I struggle with all the time, mm-hmm. because you know, I promised myself that, you know, while I'm still able to be articulate and communicate, I had to make sure that I talk to people that are not like me. Mm-hmm. I gotta go out and talk to people whose views are often very different, very much the opposite. Mm-hmm. That's one of my missions. So I always think it's wrong when you have, for example, you know, sort of people like you and me, and we would just laugh in the corner and say, ho, 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 how stupid they are. It's very tempting to just basically dismiss them. You know, and often they are not very bright, but nevertheless, instead of laughing at them, we should ask the question of how can we somehow get them to think. Mm-hmm. So what I do, not always successfully, is whenever I give a lecture to an audience that consists of students and academics that are not like me, my job is to, at the very least, get them to doubt their own views, get them to ask questions about, is this really right? And try to get them to think about stuff. And I think that's possible. I think that our mission needs to be one of not being, you know, allowing us to be segregated, but to break out of our intellectual ghettos. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we could end up being as bad as they are, you know, because, you know, you cannot have a modern sort of dynamic world unless there is an intellectual interaction, unless you break down these bubbles that mm-hmm. you're talking about.
You are speaking from the heart of any Hungarian ambassador, because we are sometimes talking to audiences that disagree with us, but I have a very firm belief that we need to talk to all audiences. Mm.
Yes, a bit connected to that question, so let's remind that your book Defense of Borders and the Drawing of Borders, that is making distinctions also. You start from a general observation that most Western societies have been alienated from borders and social boundaries that have given meaning to human experience, and that this is evident in the way fundamental distinction and concepts are now being questioned. Does this kind of alienation from borders apply only to some, let's say, elite section of the society, or does it apply to more or less everyone?
Well, what you call the elite section of society, the cultural elites, have a disproportionate influence on all sections. Even when people don't agree with them, they are in control of the media outlets. You know, everybody watches Netflix. Everybody, the young kids, they all listen to the music on MTV. You know, and if you listen to the words of the songs, they communicate a certain message about what is right and what is wrong, and it's their message, you know, rather than ours. But nevertheless, there is something. There's a difference, and that was something. I have two very good experiences in my life, that a lot of bad ones. The first good experience was Hungary 1956, the revolution, when ordinary people, the kind of people that were scared to look you in the eye, and were walking, shuffling, looking at the shoelaces, suddenly took matters into their own hands. And I'll never forget that, when, you know, people somehow became almost like the authors of their destiny. It wasn't for very long, but at least that was very important. And the second experience happened much, much later, and that was in England, in Brexit. Because I know Brexit's got a bad reputation in many parts of Europe, but it was a wonderful experience to see, like where I live, all the people, you know, in the butcher shop, in the pubs, in everywhere, suddenly talk about politics and getting very animated and excited. and basically saying, look, we can take control of our lives. We can somehow, sort of take our sovereignty as a nation seriously. Whereas when I went to the university, all the professors said the very opposite. I mean, there was only 2 of us, 2 professors in the whole university that were for Brexit. Everybody else was against it. And you could see that these ordinary people, although they were a little bit influenced, nevertheless, because of their experience, saw the world a little bit differently. And that's what gives me hope, because it indicates that despite this kind of cultural, anti-border, unbounded culture, nevertheless, people's everyday life tells them that you do need limits, you need borders, you need boundaries. Otherwise, your life becomes out of control. And of course, as you know, during the COVID experience, globalism became unraveled, because if you wanted to get vaccination, you weren't going to get vaccinations from Brussels or from the World Health Organization. It was your national government that would go out and get you the vaccine. So people then realize that these borders are actually not a joke. They kind of give you the protection, the security. And of course now, after Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine, all these people who are against borders suddenly realize that what the Ukrainians are doing is defending their borders. It's something that is, again, it's not a joke. Your security, your life depends on that. So I'm kind of hopeful that it's possible by our experience to challenge the hegemony, the cultural hegemony of the elites.
The young generation takes his or her laptop and moves to 3 countries away from where they were born. Home is getting a totally different definition, I think, in modern times. And I wanted to mention a Hungarian author from Transylvania, Tamási Áron, who has the Aber trilogy. I don't know whether you read it, but the author writes about a young secular boy who, in the first part, which is called Woods in the Woods, Abel in the Woods, is experiencing his homeland, Transylvania, and then he moves to the town. The second part is called Abel in the Town, and the third one, Abel is in the United States. And he's searching for the meaning of life. And then he talks to somebody in the United States and asks, what is the most important element of our existence? Why are we on Earth? And the answer is, we are on Earth to be at home somewhere. And then he moves back to Transylvania. This is the end of the story. So how can we, and it's connected to the roots question as well, how can we kind of redefine home, if we need to redefine it, or should we not redefine home for this new generation?
There's no way I can answer that question. It's something that we all struggle with, because what underpins your question is, what kind of experiences give meaning to our life? How do we find meaning? And this is a problem that even existed 100 years ago. If you look at all the great literature of the interwar period, it's all about this search for a home, and that sense of homelessness is something that people feel sometimes even when they live in the same place as they did beforehand. So there's no physical solution to what is an existential problem, I don't think. But nevertheless, somehow or another, I think the only way that we can give a sense of home and the meaning that's attached to it is related to your first question, to do with roots. And roots doesn't simply mean like in a plant, a physical root. It means that you are embedded, you're kind of bounded in a certain moral framework, that you know that that you come from somewhere, and you're connected to where you come from. And I think one of the most important things that we can do is when we socialize young people, and we do it not just the parents but the whole community. When we socialize young people, we are able to get them to be embedded in this ideal of where they come from, who they are. And I find what's very interesting is I'm a very good example of somebody who's just been living everywhere, and a lot of my friends are like me, sort of. And I'm often very jealous at people who've lived in the same, like you are. You lived in, sort of the same area in Tampere. I was jealous at that kind of continuity. But one thing I find very interesting is that a lot of my friends who have lived in different places, when you go to their house, they got pictures of their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers. They become even more Hungarian than the Hungarians, or they become even more Italian than the Italians. We have a saying in English, we call them, professional Irish, or professional Italians, because they become much more, that's who they are. So when they're in England, they really play the Irish chord, and they play the Italian chord. And that's how I think in the end people find a way of constructing their home. And there's no other way. I struggle with this, sort of how you deal with it, and there's no simple answer. It's something that we have to find for ourselves.
Yeah, that actually reminds me very much about this, the greatest, the first and the best Finnish novel, Seven Brothers. It was written 1800 or published 1870, and actually the story is very much about home and making a place for your home. And so there is a saying that I don't remember exactly, by Goethe again, something about that if you have some inheritance from your parents, it isn't just that you take the inheritance, but you have to make it your own. Something like that in German that I can't say now exactly. But really this idea about that our kind of attitude or relationship to past and tradition. So we were talking about this, your book, now we have been spending some time together, and you had some idea that, because there are those borders and distinctions. So I remember that you were talking about that you should have added some more there, and could you please comment on this?
Yeah, I think about a week after I sent the book off to the publishers, I realized that there was one boundary border that I didn't talk about, which is very important, and that's the way in which the boundary between the present and the past is being destroyed. So you have this situation where in the Western world, particularly in the Anglo-American world, there's an attempt to get rid of statues and to sort of talk about the horrible things that went on in the 18th, 19th century. And it's almost as if people spend more time fixing the problems of the past than talking about the present. And there's a kind of continuous sense in which the present has become the ever-present, without any kind of boundaries, either to the past and to the future. And that's become very powerful in culture, in the way that, sort of. So, for example, if you look at Netflix, whenever they do a historical play, the historical play is always a projection of our woke concerns now to the past. So, all the heroes, sort of are women, or you have sort of a lot of black people playing a prominent role in 18th century English history, and those none, you have more homosexuals than heterosexuals in the place. It's almost like you kind of reverse all the identity groups are rediscovered in the past, and that kind of ahistorical sensibility is very, very important, because it means that we neither understand the past nor understand what's distinct about the present.
Yeah. So actually, it seems like that every phase of human history has to find its own way of getting the tradition alive again. And so actually, I was wondering, after reading your book and discussing it with my friends, because there is this need of learning judgment again. So we have to find ways to learn how to judge, how to give value, how to give meaning for things around us. Now comes the difficult question, at least in my mind, is how could people start to learn to learn making judgments, and how can the educators be educated in order to really inspiring us to make fresh judgments again?
Well, the reality is that people are making judgments all the time. It's inconceivable that you don't make judgments, because the people who say judgments are bad are judging you for making judgments. So it's everybody does it. But I think the way to do it is to give people permission to speak about their private judgments, to discuss it in public, and to give that, their views, their sensibilities, a kind of educated cultural form. I think that's the key thing, and we do that by example as well. So I think if we are seen to talk about right and wrong, good and bad, if we're seen to talk about, use a moral language, then that can get other people to want to also express themselves in a similar vocabulary.
Compromise. How can compromise, to come to a compromise, be taught to a generation which is kind of atomized in the society? I think it's in a way connected to what was asked just before me, because I'm afraid that these games over the past is sometimes a zero-sum game. Somebody needs to win and the other side needs to lose. Otherwise, in an ideal situation, they should talk.
Yeah. Well, I think compromise is a bigger problem for you than for me, being a diplomat. Mm-hmm. So I think that's for sure. I think that there is no obvious way of dealing with the reluctance to compromise. Mm-hmm. And there's no obvious way of changing that, except in one way, which is if we promote the idea of human solidarity, mm-hmm. and if we promote the idea that at the end of the day, we are forced to help each other and watch each other's back at some level, and that unless we learn to sign up to some common values, mm-hmm. that society will disintegrate. And I think you can use examples. So, for example, just imagine if the people in Ukraine were having major debates about gender or major debates about all of these topics. How could they unite and fight? And the interesting thing, I was in Ukraine back in March, and the one thing that I've noticed is the one thing that they do have is an element of solidarity, of coming together, which I think is really quite crucial. And that's something that we're missing very much in Western Europe, where there's a kind of great kind of fragmentation. So it seems to me that we have got to get people to understand that the really important things are more than just them, right? It's not just about you, which is the way we see things now. It's just not about me. There are things that are more important, and that's something that we just got to bring down to earth.
Yeah. In addition to judgment, a central concept in your book is is openness, and you are right. You write that this in your book that this openness has been transformed from a descriptive concept to into a value, an ideology of openness. Could you tell us a bit more about what you mean by this, and how is this openness related to non-judgmentalism, and are some of the and what are the consequences of this transformation of openness?
Well, you know, we all like to be open. That's nothing really wrong with that. When openness becomes a good in and of itself, what it does is it basically means that everything is put on public display. And one of the consequences of that is that the distinction between the public sphere and the private sphere goes. And in any civilized world, you need to have a domain of the private, where what people do is their business and it's not exposed to everyday life. And then you have the domain of the public. At the moment, we're kind of confusing the two because of openness. So politicians are judged not by what they achieve in public, but their personal character, like Boris Johnson in England. I don't care about his personal flaws and problems. What I do care about is what does he do in public, and that goes for everybody else. And if you confuse the two, then you end up with the worst possible world, because we end up talking about scandals instead of political issues. And then we also find it difficult to have our own private lives, because people are very interested in what you do in your bedroom and what your sexuality is. That becomes a big political issue. And so I think that one of the most damaging consequences of this boundaryless is that the private and the public sphere are no longer separated in the way they should be. It all becomes kind of blurred, and that's really what I was getting at, and it's something that I was quite surprised to discover, because openness is now used politically as a way of opening up a society. It's almost used as a way of we have to see what you're doing. You know, you cannot, you're not allowed to be able to make decisions on your own unless it's openly accountable.
I'd like to take you to another kind of level of identity. I'd like to ask about the notion of nation. The Hungarians sometimes are kind of criticized for being too nationalistic, but I also want to bring here another thought, that every nation wants to kind of exist or wants to survive in its existence. There is even a book on Hungarian history called The Will to Survive, and I told the author, Sir Brian Cartridge, at one point that you understood us, because for Hungarians this is a major issue, that because of the different storms of history we are still existing. So what is the function of the nation in our times?
Well, I think what the nation is, it represents a medium through which sort of people develop their cultural and sort of moral sensibilities. And when they do that, when they develop their cultural moral sensibilities, they don't do that in the abstract. They do that in relation to a language. They do that in relation to a particular way of life. And therefore, sort of being Hungarian or being English or being French is in a sense provides a medium through which our personality and our communities gain definition. And in many ways, the really important thing about the nation is that it allows us to express our humanity in a particular form. And that particularity of being Hungarian has got a certain unique quality to it, which is a really positive contribution both to the people living in Hungary but also to the rest of the world. To me, one of the exciting things about being part of humanity is that we have very many different national characteristics and very many national ways of being a human being. And that is something that I find very exciting, but it also creates a dynamic which makes the whole world much better. And that's the very opposite to what people argue against the nation, who think that being part of a nation is somehow a bad thing. It's very nationalistic, it's very aggressive. They don't realize that if you abolish the nation, then what you do is you also abolish the kind of basis on which kind of cultural experimentation and the cultivation of a personality can really take place and occur. You know, culture comes from the Latin word, which is to do with cultivation. You're kind of nourishing, you're cultivating a certain way of being. And it seems to me that the reason why you want to hold on to that as a Hungarian would be because if you don't hold on to that, then you annihilate your very existence in terms of what you are. And that's bad for Hungary, but it's also bad for the rest of the world, because it means that they become deprived of a very valuable cultural resource from which other people in the world can learn and interact with.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I would like to ask one more question, because of this, the idea of nation is very much what our association is kind of doing with and trying to really try to let people to find the positive meanings of a nation, and this is one of the functions or goals of our association, and one other main purposes of our association is democracy. How to promote democratical thinking and democratical practices. And so I would like to ask, what is the relationship of nation and nationhood and democracy?
Well, the way that I see it is that democracy emerges within the walls of the Greek city-states, and it becomes something that is understood as a sense of duties and responsibilities. And you are, as a citizen of a particular city-state, and playing an active public political role. Now, the way that I look at it is that it begins in the city-state, but the nation is really the smallest or the biggest area within which democracy can exist. You cannot have democracy beyond the nation, because then it's no longer bounded in any common experience. And what's important about a nation-state is that nation-state sovereignty, national sovereignty, interacts with what we call popular sovereignty. So it means that within the boundedness of a nation-state, I, as a Hungarian or as a Finn, are responsible and accountable to other Finns and to other Hungarians. They're the ones that can hold me to account. A Swedish person or a Polish person, they might be very, very nice, but they don't have to have the consequences. They don't pay the consequences of the decisions that we're making here. And therefore, anybody that opposes the nation and the nation-state is, whether they understand it or not, are anti-democratic. Because basically what they're saying is somehow you can be a citizen in the world and still have democracy, but you know very well that if you're a citizen in the world, who are you voting for? Who are the people that represent you? Who are you accountable to? If you become accountable to everybody, that simply means that you're not accountable to anybody. And that's why the cosmopolitan worldview, the anti-national nation view, actually, despite its very open-minded liberal pretensions, is both illiberal but also fundamentally anti-democratic.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, Frank Furedi. If you got interested in the ideas that we were discussing about, so you will find more to read in Frank Furedi's book, which is now published and translated and published in Finnish language. So you can read more about these ideas, and have a nice summer. Thank you.